All stories are dramatized recreations. Named locations are fictionalized. Any resemblance to real persons is coincidental.
Eliner, architect. The sound that ripped from my throat was not a sob. It was not a scream. It was the visceral, tearing noise of a foundation giving way. A sound I, as an architect, had only ever heard in nightmares about catastrophic structural failure. But this was not concrete and steel. This was my life. And it was shattering in the one place I had been promised it was safest. In Dr. Evans's softly lit office, on a beige linen sofa that smelled of lavender and false hope. Daniel sat beside me. The distance between us on that couch had become a familiar chasm over the past 6 months, a space we'd come here to bridge. His hand, which had been resting on his knee, twitched. He didn't look at me. He looked at the abstract painting on the wall behind Dr. Evans's head, a swirl of muted grays and blues that now felt like a mockery of complexity. My own complexity was a boiling, black tar inside my chest. "Eliner," Dr. Evans said, her voice calibrated to a perfect, professional calm that made me want to throw the box of tissues at her head. "Can you articulate what you're feeling right now?" I couldn't breathe. The air was thick with the unspoken. For weeks, we'd been dancing around it. The late nights. The new passcode on his phone. The way he'd started a story about a client dinner last Tuesday, describing the wine, the appetizers, the fucking tablecloth with a level of detail so meticulous it was like he was building a diorama. Daniel, who could barely remember the plot of a movie we'd seen the night before, had recounted the entire evening with the precision of a forensic scientist. I had noted it, filed it away in the growing cabinet of my suspicion, a cabinet I was too terrified to open. "I'm feeling," I began, my voice a rusty hinge. I clutched the sleeve of my cashmere sweater, a Christmas gift from Daniel 2 years ago when things were still soft. "I'm feeling like I'm in a room and the walls are made of lies. And they're getting thinner. I can hear everything on the other side." Daniel shifted. "Ellie, not this again. We're here to fix things, not to play detective with my anecdotes." The nickname, Ellie, which usually felt like a warm blanket, now sounded like a weapon. A tool to infantilize my pain. "It's not an anecdote, Daniel." The words erupted, sharp and hot. "It's the texture of the lie. You've never been that detailed about anything in your life. You forgot our own wedding anniversary until your mother called. But you can remember the specific vintage of a Cabernet you supposedly drank with a client named Brent. Who the hell is Brent?" Dr. Evans leaned forward. "Daniel, Eliner is expressing a need for consistency. The discrepancy she's noticing is causing significant distress. Can you address the level of detail she's referring to?" He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I once found endearing, now just a performance of exasperation. "It was a memorable night, okay? It was a big deal. We landed the account. I was present. I'm trying to be more present. That's what you wanted, right? For me to be more engaged when I talk about my day?" He was using the language of therapy against me, turning the tools meant for repair into scalpels to dissect my sanity. I felt a dizzying vertigo. This was the gaslighting I'd read about, the slow, insidious poison that makes you doubt the very ground you walk on. "Engaged?" I whispered, staring at his profile. At the familiar slope of his nose, the tiny scar above his eyebrow from a childhood accident. This was the man I had built a life with for 12 years, the father of my child. We had designed our future together, line by line, like one of my blueprints. "You weren't engaged, you were rehearsed." The silence that followed was heavier than any sound. It pressed down on us. Dr. Evans waited, her gaze moving between us. I could feel the moment stretching, thinning. This was it. The wall was about to crack. And then Daniel made his mistake. A small, almost imperceptible one. He sighed, a long, suffering sigh, and said, "I don't know what you want from me, Ellie. I can't win. If I'm vague, you're suspicious. If I'm specific, you're suspicious. It's like you're just looking for a reason for this to fail." His eyes flickered to me for a second, then darted away, down to the floor. But in that flicker, I saw it. Not guilt, not anger. Fear. A pure, unadulterated fear that chilled me to the bone. And in that chilling moment, a name surfaced from the deep, dark waters of my memory. A name I hadn't thought of in over a decade. Sarah. Sarah Jennings, his college girlfriend, the one he'd called the one who got away in a drunken, sentimental moment years ago, the one who had moved to Denver. The one who, according to a random comment he'd made months ago, had moved back to Colorado Springs. The detail, the perfect, unnecessary detail about the dinner, it wasn't for me, it was for him. It was a story he had told someone else. A story he was proud of. A story about a real night with a real person. A person who wasn't me. The pieces clicked into place with a sound that was almost audible. The late nights in Colorado Springs. The new, sudden interest in his appearance. The way he'd been distant, yes, but also lighter at times, as if carrying a delicious secret. My mouth went dry. The world telescoped until it contained only Daniel's face, pale and tense, and the pounding of my own heart in my ears. "Sarah," I said. The word was not loud. It was flat, final, like a stone dropping into a still pond. Daniel's head snapped up. His eyes widened, the pupils dilating with pure, animal panic. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The blood draining from his face was a confession more eloquent than any words could ever be. "Oh my God," I breathed. The words were barely a whisper, but they echoed in the silent room. Dr. Evans straightened up. "Eleanor, Daniel, what's happening?" But I was already gone. I was no longer in that room. I was falling through the cracks of the life I had built. I saw our wedding day, him crying as I walked down the aisle. I saw him holding our newborn son, Liam, his face a mask of terrified wonder. I saw us painting the walls of our first house, covered in paint, laughing. Every memory, every cherished moment was now tainted, retroactively poisoned. Had he been thinking of her then? Had our entire marriage been a placeholder? The grief hit me not as a wave, but as a sudden, brutal vacuum. It sucked the air from my lungs, the warmth from my skin. I was a shell, a blueprint for a building that had never been, and now never would be, constructed. I stood up. My legs were numb, but they held. Daniel was staring at me, his mouth slightly agape, a silent plea in his eyes. "Don't," but it was too late. The foundation was gone. The structure had collapsed. "Eleanor, please," Dr. Evans said, her calm finally cracking. "Let's talk about this." I looked at Daniel, really looked at him. The man I loved was gone. In his place was a stranger who had taken a sledgehammer to our world. "There's nothing left to talk about," I said, my voice eerily calm. I walked to the door, each step feeling like I was walking on the debris of my own life. I didn't look back. I opened the door and stepped out into the bland, beige hallway, leaving the ruins of my marriage behind me in that room. The silence I left behind was the loudest sound I had ever heard. The world outside Dr. Evans's office was a study in surreal, mundane cruelty. The sun was shining. A bird was chirping somewhere. A car drove past, its radio playing a pop song I recognized. How could the universe continue its careless orbit when mine had just been knocked clean off its axis? The asphalt of the parking lot felt unstable beneath my feet, as if it might liquefy at any moment. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking so violently the metal teeth chattered a frantic rhythm against each other. I don't remember the drive home. My body operated the car on a kind of autopilot, a pre-programmed function of a creature that was no longer truly there. My mind was a tornado of shattered images and sounds. "Sarah," the name echoed, a taunt, Daniel's face pale and guilty, the beige sofa, the lavender smell, the crack in his voice when I said the name. Each memory was a shard of glass, cutting me from the inside. I pulled into the driveway of our house, a 2-story colonial in a quiet cul-de-sac, a house I had designed, every line and angle a testament to the future we were going to have. The windows looked like dead eyes now. The welcoming front porch was a stage for a lie. I sat in the car, engine off, and stared at the door. This was no longer a home. It was a crime scene. And I was the sole detective, medical examiner, and victim, all rolled into one. The sound of a basketball bouncing next door broke my trance. Life. Other people's lives, continuing. I had to go inside. I had to face the ghost of the man I thought I knew, the ghost that haunted every room. The door clicked open, and the silence of the house rushed out to meet me. It was heavier than the silence in the therapist's office. This silence was filled with 12 years of accumulated life. It smelled of the lemon-scented cleaner I used on Saturdays, of the faint, familiar scent of Daniel's cologne that had seeped into the upholstery, of the leftover aroma of the pancakes I'd made for Liam this morning. This morning, it felt like a lifetime ago, I was an archaeologist entering a tomb of a civilization that had just been wiped out. My first instinct was practical, a reflex born from a decade of motherhood. Liam, my son. He was at his friend's house for a post-school playdate. I had a few hours. A few hours before I would have to look into my 9-year-old's trusting eyes and what? Tell him his father was a stranger. That the world was not a safe, predictable place. The weight of that impending conversation threatened to crush me completely. I couldn't do it. Not yet. I walked through the house like a ghost. The living room, with the large sectional we'd saved for, where we'd spent countless movie nights, Liam nestled between us. Now I saw only the empty space where Daniel's body should be, a body that had been betraying me in another woman's arms. The kitchen, with the island where we'd shared coffee and rushed breakfasts. I saw him standing there, smiling, while his phone, perhaps, buzzed in his pocket with a message from her. I ended up in our bedroom, the epicenter of the betrayal. The bed was neatly made, the way I always left it, but all I could see was his pillow. Had he lain here, next to me, thinking of her? Had he compared us? The revulsion was so physical I stumbled back into the hallway, my hand flying to my mouth. I was drowning in the imagery, in the poison of my own imagination. I needed to do something, anything. I needed to expel this toxic energy from my body or I would disintegrate. The grief was a wild animal, clawing at my insides. Crying felt insufficient. Screaming felt cliché. Breaking things felt dangerous and, frankly, too much effort. My eyes scanned the hallway, landing on a small, framed print of one of my earliest architectural sketches. And that's when the idea began to form. Not as a coherent plan, but as a raw, desperate impulse. Redecorating. The word surfaced from the randomized parameters of my new, absurd reality. It wasn't just about moving furniture. It was about demolition. I walked back into the living room, my architect's eye now seeing the space not as a home, but as a structure built on a fault line. Every object, every color, every arrangement was a collaboration. A decision made together, a memory, and every memory was now a weapon. I started with the bookshelf. There was a photograph in a silver frame, a professional shot from a vacation in Hawaii 5 years ago. We were tanned, laughing, his arms wrapped around me from behind. I looked happy. I looked blind. I took the frame, my fingers cold against the metal. I didn't throw it. I opened the back methodically and slid the photograph out. I stared at our smiling faces for a long moment. Then I tore it in half, straight down the middle, separating me from him. The sound of the ripping paper was shockingly loud and profoundly satisfying. I dropped his half on the floor and put my half back in the frame, placing it askew on the shelf. A new statement piece. The monument to the divided whole. This small act of controlled destruction unlocked something in me. A frantic, focused energy. This was a language I understood. Not the messy, incomprehensible language of heartbreak, but the clear, logical language of space, form, and function. I went to the garage and found the toolbox. I pulled out a crowbar. The weight of it in my hand was solid, real. I marched back into the bedroom, to the large, ornately carved headboard. It had been a compromise. I'd wanted something minimalist. He'd loved the traditional, heavy look. We'd found this one, a blend of both, or so we'd thought. Now I saw it only as his, a symbol of his presence, of the weight of his betrayal. I positioned the claw of the crowbar where the headboard met the bed frame. I took a breath, a deep, shuddering one that felt like the first real breath I'd taken since the therapist's office. Then I leaned my weight into it. The wood groaned, protested, and then, with a loud, splintering crack, it gave way. The sound was violent, cathartic. It was the sound of the crack in my life made manifest. I worked with a savage efficiency, prying and pulling until the headboard was detached, leaning against the wall like a defeated monster. Sweat dripped down my temple, but I felt a cold clarity. This wasn't redecorating. This was an exorcism. I dragged the headboard out of the room, leaving scuff marks on the hardwood floor. I didn't care. The marks were part of the new story. I moved to the closet. I yanked his suits, his shirts, his jeans off their hangers. I didn't fold them. I made a pile in the center of the room, a mound of his life, his scent. It smelled like him, and the smell made me nauseous, but I kept going. I was stripping the room of his DNA. Hours blurred. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, illuminating the chaos I was creating. I moved furniture. I took down curtains. I rolled up rugs. The house, once a picture of curated domesticity, was becoming a construction site. My construction site. With every item I moved, every piece of him I isolated, I felt a tiny, minuscule fraction of the weight lift. I was reclaiming the territory. I was drawing new lines. The pinnacle of the frenzy was the wall. The accent wall in the living room, which we had painted a deep, warm burgundy. It had been a bold choice. We'd done it together one weekend, laughing, getting paint everywhere. Now, the color felt oppressive, like dried blood. I went back to the garage and found cans of paint. A pure, stark, brilliant white. Primer. I didn't bother with drop cloths. I opened the can, stirred the paint, and dipped a large roller into it. The first swipe of white across the burgundy was a shock to the system. It was obliteration. It was silence. I painted over the memories, over the compromises, over the life we had built. The roller moved with a rhythmic swish thump, a mantra of erasure. With each stroke, I felt myself getting stronger, harder, cleaner. I was covered in sweat, dust, and splatters of white paint when I heard the key in the front door. My heart stopped. Liam. He walked in, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his face smudged with dirt from playing. He stopped dead in the doorway to the living room, his eyes wide as saucers, taking in the disarray. The furniture shoved together in the center of the room, the pile of his father's clothes, the half-painted white wall stark against the old burgundy. "Mom," he asked, his voice small and confused. What happened?" I lowered the paint roller, my arms aching. I looked at my son, at his innocent, worried face. The animal grief was gone, replaced by a fierce, terrifyingly clear protectiveness. The world was not safe. But this space, this house, would be. I would make it safe again, for him, for me. I managed a smile, a fragile but genuine thing. "We're just making some changes, sweetie," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "Big changes." And in that moment, surrounded by the beautiful, chaotic wreckage of my old life, I knew it was true. This wasn't the end. It was the demolition phase, and every architect knows. Demolition is the necessary, violent, glorious prelude to a new foundation. The white paint dried into a scab over the old life. For a week, the house existed in a state of suspended animation. The living room was a monochrome canvas of pushed-aside furniture and drop cloths, the bedroom a Spartan cell with a headboard-less bed. The pile of Daniel's belongings sat in the garage like an unclaimed corpse. He was staying at a hotel, his texts a cascade of pleas, excuses, and finally, angry justifications that I deleted without reading. The silence he left behind was my new element, and I was learning to breathe in it. Liam was quiet, observant. He'd eye the white wall, the empty spaces where pictures used to be, with a solemnity that broke my heart. I kept my explanations simple, a mantra I repeated until it started to feel true. "Daddy and I are having some problems. We need to live apart for a while. It's not your fault. We both love you more than anything." He'd just nod, his small hand finding mine, and the fierce, protective love I felt would surge, a clean burning fuel against the cold despair. But after Liam was asleep, the silence would thicken and the thoughts would come. Not the raging tornado of the first day, but a low, insidious hum of inadequacy. What did I do wrong? Was I not enough? Smart enough? Pretty enough? Was it because I got so absorbed in my work? My mind, trained to solve complex structural problems, was trying to solve this. It was searching for the critical design flaw in me that had caused the entire structure to fail. It was in one of these loops, pacing the pristine white living room at 2 a.m., that I saw it. Leaning against the wall in a corner, behind a stack of design books I'd yet to reshelve, was a long, narrow case. Dusty, forgotten. A relic from a life before mortgages and pediatrician appointments. My college electric guitar. A Fender Stratocaster, a graduation gift to myself. I'd played in a laughably earnest indie band for a few years after architecture school, a creative release valve against the rigid precision of my day job. I'd loved the noise of it, the physicality. But then, career, marriage, motherhood, the guitar had been quietly retired, a symbol of a wilder, less responsible self I'd apparently needed to shed. The randomized parameter flashed in my mind. Learning to play the electric guitar at full volume. It had seemed abstract when the system generated it. Now, it felt like a command from the universe, or from my own forgotten psyche. I walked over and unzipped the case. The guitar lay nestled in faded blue velvet, smelling of old wood and dust. It was still beautiful. I lifted it out, the weight of it familiar and foreign in my hands. The amplifier was in the basement, I knew. A small, practice-sized Fender Champ. An hour later, I was sitting cross-legged on the floor of the White Room, the guitar plugged in, the amp humming with a low, electrical threat. I hadn't turned it on yet. I was just holding the instrument, my fingers fumbling over the strings, trying to remember a single chord. My architect's brain, so adept at reading blueprints and visualizing spatial relationships, was utterly baffled by the fretboard. It was in a logical grid. My fingers, skilled with a drafting pencil and a computer mouse, felt thick and stupid. I found a diagram of a G major chord online. It looked simple enough. Index finger here, middle finger there, ring finger there. I pressed my fingertips against the steel strings. They bit into my skin with a sharp, painful protest. I strummed. The sound that came out of the amplifier was not music. It was a muffled, dead thud, punctuated by a hideous buzzing. Several strings were muted. The ones that rang out were sour, out of tune. The dissonance was physically painful. It was the sound of my failure made audible. A wave of frustration, so hot and sudden it brought tears to my eyes, washed over me. I couldn't even do this. I couldn't even make a simple three-finger chord sound pure. I was failing at grief, failing at reinvention. Daniel's voice echoed in my head, from a fight we'd had years ago. "You have to be perfect at everything, Ellie. It's exhausting." I almost put the guitar down. I almost succumbed to the voice, to the proof of my own inadequacy. But then I looked at the white wall. I remembered the crack of the crowbar breaking the headboard. That hadn't been perfect. It had been messy, violent, and utterly necessary. Screw perfect. I turned the volume knob on the amplifier. Not to a polite level, all the way up. The hum became a roar. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. I didn't try a chord again. I just laid my index finger across all 6 strings at the 3rd fret and strummed hard. BRRRZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZZz. A wall of distorted, chaotic sound slammed into the white walls of the room, reverberating through the floor, vibrating in my teeth. It was the most horrible, beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of my pain. It was the sound of my anger. It had no melody, no harmony, no structure. It was pure, uncensored feedback. I did it again, and again. I moved my finger up and down the neck, creating different shades of screaming dissonance. I wasn't trying to play music. I was trying to exorcise a demon. The noise filled the house, so loud it felt like it might blow the windows out. I hoped the neighbors heard it. I hoped the sound traveled all the way to Daniel's hotel room. I hoped it shook the foundations of the world that had allowed this to happen. Tears were streaming down my face now, but I was smiling, a wild, unhinged grin. I hit a power chord by accident, my fingers finally finding a shape that felt strong. Dum-dum-dum, it was primal, it was powerful. For 20 minutes I was not a leaner, the betrayed wife, the struggling architect, the worried mother. I was a force of nature. I was noise. I was chaos. I was reclaiming the soundscape of my own life, which had been so silent and sterile for too long. When I finally stopped, my fingers were throbbing, raw with the beginnings of blisters. The silence that rushed back in was ringing, alive. It was no longer an empty silence. It was a silence I had carved out for myself with sheer, glorious volume. I looked at the guitar with new respect. This wasn't about becoming a musician. This was about finding a voice when my own had been stolen. It was about tolerating dissonance until it started to sound like a new kind of harmony. The next night, I tried again. My fingers were sore, but the memory of the power chord was a siren's call. I found an online tutorial. I learned how to tune the strings. The simple, meditative act of turning the pegs until each string resonated in harmony with a pure tone was a balm. It was a process. It had a beginning, a middle, and an end. Unlike my grief, which felt like a circular maze, I practiced until my fingertips were numb. The chords still sounded clumsy, the transitions were jagged. But now, nestled between the mistakes, there were moments of pure, clean sound. A ringing open chord. A correctly fingered a minor that hung in the air, sweet and sad. I was building something. Not a building, but a new neural pathway. A new skill, a new way of being. The guitar wasn't an escape from the pain, it was a vessel for it. I could pour my frustration into a failed scale run, my sadness into a slow, mournful strum, my burgeoning defiance into that roaring power chord. One night, about 3 weeks into this new ritual, I was practicing a simple blues progression. It was still rough, but I could play it all the way through without stopping. The door to the living room creaked open. Liam stood there in his dinosaur pajamas, rubbing his eyes. "Mom," he whispered. I heard the music. I froze, expecting fear or annoyance. "I'm sorry, baby. Did I wake you up?" He shook his head and padded into the room, climbing onto the sofa to listen. He didn't say anything. He just watched my hands on the fretboard, his head tilted. I started playing again, more softly this time. The simple, looping pattern. After a minute, I saw him, out of the corner of my eye, nodding his head slightly to the rhythm. A tiny, almost imperceptible movement. A feeling bloomed in my chest, warm and bright, so different from the cold fury of the feedback loop. It was hope. Not a naive hope that everything would be okay, but a solid, earned hope that I would be okay. That we would be okay. The music, in all its imperfect, raw glory, wasn't pushing him away. It was drawing him in. It was becoming the new soundtrack of our home. And for the first time since the crack appeared, that soundtrack didn't feel like a lie. The guitar became my secret language, a nightly dialect of grit and grace that my son and I alone understood. But daylight demanded a different vocabulary. The vocabulary of deadlines, building codes, and client meetings. The vocabulary of my professional life, which I had to re-enter like a ghost returning to a familiar haunt, unsure if I could still touch the living world. My architecture firm, Sterling and Associates, was a sleek, glass and steel affair in downtown Denver. Walking back into the office after a week of personal leave, vaguely attributed to family matters, felt like stepping onto a movie set where I'd forgotten my lines. The hum of the HVAC, the click of keyboards, the soft ping of the elevator, it was all the same, but the resonance was different. I felt transparent, as if everyone could see the fresh scars underneath my tailored blazer. I kept waiting for someone to offer condolences, but of course, no one knew. The catastrophe that had obliterated my personal life was a silent, internal earthquake, invisible to the outside world. The normality of it all was a special kind of torture. My desk was piled with work. The most pressing project was the one I'd been leading before my life fissured, the renovation and modernization of a historic library branch. It was a dream project, a delicate balance of preserving old bones and installing a new heart. But the blueprint spread across my screen now looked like hieroglyphics from a civilization I no longer understood. The precision, the harmony, the promise of creating something lasting felt like a cruel joke. How could I design a structure meant to stand for decades when my own had collapsed in an afternoon? My boss, Susan Sterling, a woman whose elegance was as sharp as her business acumen, called me into her corner office. The wall of windows behind her desk offered a panoramic view of the Rockies, a sight that usually filled me with inspiration. Today, the peaks looked like jagged teeth. "Eleanor, welcome back," she said, her eyes scanning me with a quick, professional assessment. I knew she saw the slight tremor in my hand as I accepted the cup of water she offered. "How are you?" The question, so simple, was a trapdoor. I could fall through it and never climb out. I gripped the glass tighter. "I'm managing, Susan, thank you, eager to get back to the library project." She nodded, accepting the deflection. "Good, because we've hit a snag. The city's Historical Preservation Board is demanding a second independent review of the structural integration plans. Specifically, the proposed glass atrium linking the old and new wings. They're concerned about load-bearing stresses on the original brickwork. A snag, a problem. This I could handle. Problems with solutions, this was my language. I see, we have the original calculations from our engineering firm. They want a fresh set of eyes. An outside consultant, someone with a reputation for innovative structural solutions in sensitive historical contexts. Susan slid a business card across her polished desk. "The board has suggested this firm. They're based in Boulder, but they're the best in the region for this kind of thing." I picked up the card. The stock was thick, creamy. The font was clean, modern, understated. Blackwood Structural Engineering and Design Ian Blackwood, Principal Engineer A name. A title, nothing more. It felt like just another piece of paperwork, another variable in an equation. A necessary step to get the project back on track. I've set up a meeting for tomorrow morning at the site, Susan continued. He's going to meet you there at 9, walk him through the plans, our rationale, win him over a leaner. The board trusts his judgment implicitly. If he signs off, we're golden. Of course, I said, my voice finding a steadiness it had lacked for weeks. This was a task, a mission. I could be a leaner the architect, even if a leaner the wife was in ruins. It was a suit of armor I could put on. The next morning, I stood in the cavernous, dusty silence of the old library. Sunlight streamed through the grimy high windows, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the air like forgotten words. The space smelled of old paper, dry rot, and potential. I had my tablet with the blueprints, a hard hat under my arm, and a professional demeanor I'd glued on as carefully as lipstick. I heard the heavy side door creak open. Footsteps echoed on the bare concrete floor. I turned, ready to greet Ian Blackwood, the consultant, the variable. And for the first time in over a month, my carefully constructed composure didn't just crack, it shattered. The man walking toward me was not what I'd expected. I'd pictured someone older, with glasses and a stoop, a human calculator. This man was probably my age, maybe a year or two older. He was tall, with the solid, practical build of someone who understood weight and balance not just from equations, but from lifting heavy things. He wore dark jeans, scuffed work boots, and a simple gray Henley that did nothing to hide the strength in his shoulders. His hair was a thick, unruly brown, and his face was kind. Not handsome in a polished, magazine way, but with strong features and eyes that seemed to take in the entire room, and me with a calm, focused intelligence. He stopped a few feet away, a faint, professional smile on his face. "Elena Reed?" His voice was a warm baritone, steady as a bedrock. I realized I was staring. I had forgotten to breathe. This was ridiculous. I was a professional, a principal architect. I dealt with contractors, engineers, difficult clients every day. But the simple, unexpected presence of this solid man had thrown me completely off balance. It was the first time I'd been truly seen by a man, a stranger, since Daniel's betrayal. And I felt terrifyingly seen. "Yes, that's me," I finally managed, my voice coming out slightly strangled. I extended my hand. "You must be Ian Blackwood." His handshake was firm, warm, and brief, no lingering pressure. "I am." "It's a pleasure. This is quite a space." He looked up, his gaze scanning the vaulted ceiling, the intricate cornice work. "The potential is incredible." And just like that, he was all business. He pulled a laser measure from his tool belt. "Shall we start with the proposed junction point for the atrium? I'd like to get some initial measurements before we look at the prints." I nodded, grateful for the anchor of work. "Of course. Right this way." For the next hour, we walked through the skeletal remains of the library. I talked about my vision, the dialogue between old and new, the metaphor of light and knowledge flowing from the historic stacks into the modern community space. I explained the load distribution calculations, the choice of steel supports designed to be almost invisible. He listened, intently. He didn't just hear, he absorbed. He asked sharp, insightful questions that weren't challenges, but explorations. "Have you considered the lateral shift during a seismic event? The original mortar has a different flexibility than your new materials." He wasn't looking for flaws. He was looking for the truth of the structure. I found myself talking more than I'd intended, my passion for the project reigniting under his genuine curiosity. It was the first conversation I'd had in weeks that wasn't about divorce lawyers, child custody, or my own shattered psyche. It was about ideas, creation. It was an intellectual lifeline. At one point, as we stood in the spot where the glass atrium would rise, he pointed to a series of cracks in the brickwork above us. "See that pattern? That's not settlement. That's from the original timber roof trusses shifting over a century. Your engineers are right to reinforce, but their solution is a bit brute force." He pulled out a small notebook and a pencil, an actual pencil, and began to sketch. A series of smaller, strategically placed carbon fiber straps would be less invasive, preserve more of the original fabric, and provide more dynamic support. He showed me the sketch. It was elegant, simple, brilliant. It was a better solution. I looked from the sketch to his face, to the focused intensity in his eyes as he explained the physics. and I felt a jolt that had nothing to do with architecture. It was the thrill of being in the presence of a true master of his craft. It was respect, a clean, uncomplicated emotion I'd almost forgotten. "That's genius," I said, and I meant it. He smiled, a real smile this time, that reached his eyes and created tiny crinkles at the corners. "It's just physics, and a deep-seated hatred for unnecessary drilling." We shared a laugh. It was a short, simple sound, but in the dusty, empty library, it felt revolutionary. It was the first time I had laughed, genuinely laughed, since before. The sound seemed to hang in the air between us, a fragile new thing. The meeting concluded with him promising a full report within the week, but his initial impression was positive. He believed the design was sound, and with his suggested modifications, it would be exceptional. We walked back toward the entrance. The professional barrier I had erected felt thin, porous. The silence between us was no longer just about the project. "It was a real pleasure working with you, Aliner," he said as we stepped out into the bright Colorado morning. "You have a remarkable vision for this place." "Thank you, Ian. The feeling is mutual. Your insight was invaluable." He nodded, hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Good luck with everything." It was a standard pleasantry, but the way he said it, the slight pause, made me wonder if he saw something after all. Not the details of my disaster, but the shadow of it, the weariness around my eyes. "Thank you," I said again, feeling suddenly vulnerable. He got into a practical, well-used Toyota 4Runner and drove away. I stood on the sidewalk, the sun warm on my face, the ghost of his handshake still on my skin, the echo of his laugh in my ears. The world felt different, not fixed, not even close, but the monochrome palette of my grief had been injected with a single, unexpected spot of color. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was simply the recognition that there were still people in the world who were competent and kind, and who used pencils to sketch elegant solutions to complex problems. I got into my car and sat there for a long time, not starting the engine. I wasn't thinking about Daniel. I wasn't thinking about the betrayal. I was thinking about carbon fiber straps and the intelligent light in a stranger's eyes. It was a small shift, a minute recalibration. But for the first time, the future, while still unknown, didn't feel entirely like a desolate wasteland. It felt, ever so slightly, like a site with potential. The encounter with Ian Blackwood left a residue, a faint, persistent hum like the ringing in your ears after a concert. Driving away from the library, the silence in my car was no longer empty. It was filled with the echo of his voice, the memory of his pencil skating across paper. I tried to dismiss it as professional admiration, the simple pleasure of meeting a competent peer. But it was more than that. It was the shock of feeling seen as something other than a victim. He'd looked at me and seen an architect, a collaborator. He hadn't seen the crack running through my foundation. I walked back into my house, my construction zone of a home, and the contrast was jarring. The stark white walls I had painted with such vengeful purpose now felt sterile, almost aggressive. The silence here was different from the library's dusty quiet. It was a heavy, domestic silence, pregnant with the ghost of arguments and the memory of a family that no longer existed. Liam was at school. The emptiness was absolute. I had a deadline. Ian's proposed modifications to the structural plan needed to be integrated into the final blueprints before his official report even landed. It was urgent, critical work. I set up my laptop on the kitchen island, the same island where Daniel and I used to share hurried breakfasts. I opened the architectural software, the familiar grid lines filling the screen. I called up the file for the library atrium, and I couldn't focus. My mind, usually a laser of concentration when it came to design, was a scattered mess. I'd start tracing a carbon fiber strap's proposed path, and my thoughts would drift to the way Ian had squinted at the brickwork, his head tilted in assessment. I'd try to calculate a load-bearing value, and I'd hear his laugh again, a warm, solid sound in the cavernous library. It was infuriating. This was my sanctuary, my work. It was the one part of my identity that Daniel's betrayal hadn't been able to touch. And now this stranger, in the space of a single morning, had thrown it into disarray simply by being present, by being capable, by being kind. A fresh wave of anger washed over me, but this time it was directed inward. Was I so starved for positive male attention that one professional interaction could unravel me? Was my emotional state this fragile? The grief I understood. The rage I understood. This flicker of something else, this confusing cocktail of attraction and resentment, was a new and unwelcome variable. Frustrated, I pushed the laptop away. The screen glared back at me, a mosaic of unfinished lines. I needed to get out of my head. I needed the physical, mindless catharsis that had saved me before. I went to the white room. I plugged in the guitar. The amplifier's hum was a welcome aggression. I didn't try to play a melody or a chord progression. I just started playing scales up and down the neck, my left hand forming rigid, precise shapes, my right hand picking each note with a sharp, metallic attack. It was musical math. It was repetition. It was order. I played until the muscles in my forearm burned, until the raw tips of my fingers protested against the steel strings. The pain was a focus, a punishment, a purification. But even in the noise, I couldn't drown it out. The memory of the meeting played on a loop behind my eyes. The way he'd said, "You have a remarkable vision." It hadn't sounded like empty flattery. It had sounded like a statement of fact. Daniel's voice from the early days surfaced in contrast. "That's amazing, Ellie," he'd say about a design, but his eyes would already be drifting to his phone. The difference was stark, and it was a difference that carved out a new, hollow space of loss inside me. I hadn't just lost a husband, I had lost a witness. I had lost the person who was supposed to see me. The scales weren't working. The anger was still there, simmering. I stopped the precise picking. I let my hand fall onto the strings, creating a jarring, dissonant crunch. And then I started to play. Not anything I knew. I just let my fingers find shapes on the fretboard, my other hand striking the strings in a rough, rhythmic pattern. It was ugly, it was chaotic. It was the sound of my confusion. A low, chugging riff emerged, heavy and repetitive. It sounded like machinery grinding, like something breaking under strain. I played that riff for what felt like an hour, variations of it, building it up and breaking it down. It was a soundscape of my internal chaos, the professional frustration, the personal humiliation, the startling, unwelcome flicker of attraction. I poured it all into the noise. And slowly, as I played, the chaos began to find its own strange order. The riff started to make sense. It became a thing. It was powerful in its ugliness. It was mine. When I finally stopped, sweating and breathless, the silence felt earned. The knot in my chest had loosened. I looked at my hands, the red, indented marks on my fingertips. They were the hands of someone who was learning. Learning to hurt, learning to heal, learning to make something new out of the wreckage. The doorbell rang. The sound was so alien, so unexpected in the bubble of my solitary catharsis, that I jumped. No one came to the door anymore. Solicitors knew to avoid the house that was perpetually under construction. Friends had learned to text first, giving me a wide berth I both craved and resented. I put the guitar down, my heart thumping oddly. I walked to the front door, wiping my sweaty palms on my jeans. I didn't bother with the peephole. I just opened it, and the world tilted again. It was Ian Blackwood. He stood on my porch, holding a thick, bound report. He was still in his work clothes, the jeans, the boots, but he'd added a worn leather jacket. He looked solid, real, and completely out of place in the context of my life. His eyes widened slightly, taking me in. I was acutely aware of my appearance. Old yoga pants, a t-shirt smudged with paint and dust, hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, no makeup, and probably a wild, just played the guitar into oblivion look in my eyes. "Ian," I said, my voice hoarse from disuse and the strain of playing. What are you doing here?" He offered a slightly apologetic smile. "I'm sorry to just show up like this. I tried calling the office, but they said you were working from home today. I finished the preliminary report faster than I expected." He held up the binder. There were a few points I wanted to discuss in person, and since I was finishing up a job not far from here, I thought I'd drop it off. "I hope that's all right." He was being perfectly professional, but his presence on my doorstep felt like an earthquake. This was my territory, my mess, my sanctuary and my prison. And he was here, uninvited, seeing the half-painted doorframe, the overgrown lawn, the general air of domestic collapse. I had a choice. I could take the report, mutter thanks, and shut the door. Preserve the barrier. Keep the professional and the personal ruthlessly separate. But I didn't. "It's fine," I heard myself say. "Come in." I stepped aside. He hesitated for a moment, then crossed the threshold. He stood in the entryway, his eyes doing a quick, polite but unavoidably perceptive scan of the interior. The white room, with its pushed-aside furniture and the guitar leaning against the amplifier. The stack of moving boxes in the hall. The palpable silence of a house in transition. "I'm in the middle of some renovations," I said, the understatement hanging lamely in the air. He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. He didn't offer platitudes. He didn't ask prying questions. He just said, "It's a good space, lots of light." And in that simple, neutral observation, I felt a surge of gratitude so sharp it brought tears to my eyes. I turned away quickly, under the guise of leading him to the kitchen. "Can I get you some coffee? It's the least I can do for a house call." "Coffee would be great. Black, please." I busied myself with the coffee maker, my back to him, grateful for the mundane task. I could feel him standing there, a calm, solid presence in the center of my storm. It was unsettling. It was comforting. It was the most confusing thing I had felt in weeks. This was no longer a professional meeting. This was an unplanned load on a structure already stressed to its limit. I had no idea if I would hold, or if this unexpected weight would be the thing that finally made me collapse. But as I poured the coffee, my hands were steadier than they had been all day. The coffee steamed between us on the kitchen island, a tiny plume of normality in the surreal landscape of my life. Ian sat on a stool, the thick report open before him. I leaned against the counter opposite, putting the solid granite between us like a shield. My heart was still doing a frantic, erratic tap dance against my ribs. "So, page 7, he began, his voice all business, but his eyes kept flicking to my hands wrapped around my mug. Were they shaking? I willed them to be still. "The primary concern is the lateral torque on the eastern wall during a high-wind event. My calculations suggest the original steel I-beam solution would transfer too much stress to the historic masonry. It's overkill, and in this case, overkill is destructive." He pointed to a series of complex equations and diagrams. I forced my architect's brain to engage, to focus on the lines and numbers, not on the man explaining them. This was my language, I could do this. "I see," I said, my voice finding a steadier register. "You're proposing a distributed load system. Instead of one strong point, multiple weaker ones that act in concert." "Exactly." He looked up, and that flicker of a smile returned. "It's less about brute strength and more about intelligent flexibility, allowing the old and the new to move together, rather than fighting each other." The metaphor was so apt, so painfully applicable to my own situation, that I had to look away. I stared at a chip in the granite countertop. Intelligent flexibility. The opposite of what had happened with Daniel. Our marriage had been a study in rigid expectations and, ultimately, catastrophic failure. "It's a better solution," I admitted, meeting his gaze again. "A more elegant one." "I'm glad you think so. The board will respect it. They appreciate solutions that show a reverence for the original structure." He took a sip of his coffee. "This is good coffee." "It's the one thing I haven't messed up lately," I said before I could stop myself. The words hung in the air, a starkly personal confession in the midst of our professional discussion. Ian didn't laugh awkwardly or offer an empty reassurance. He just looked at me, his expression thoughtful. "From what I saw at the library, you don't mess much up." He said it quietly, a simple statement of fact. The doorbell rang again, a shrill, insistent sound that made us both jump. My first, irrational thought was Daniel, that he'd chosen this exact, impossibly inconvenient moment to show up. Panic, cold and sharp, shot through me. I didn't think I could handle a confrontation. Not here, not now, not in front of Ian. "Excuse me," I said, my voice tight. I went to the door, my legs feeling like wood. I peeked through the side light. It wasn't Daniel. It was a delivery truck driver, holding a tablet and looking bored. Relief washed over me, so potent it left me dizzy. I opened the door. "Elena Reed, sign for a delivery," the man said, thrusting the tablet toward me. "Delivery?" I was confused. I hadn't ordered anything. "Says here, furniture assembly, 1 bookshelf, maple." He pointed to the curb, where a large, flat cardboard box lay next to his truck, and then I remembered. Weeks ago, in the first frantic days of my redecorating, I'd ordered a simple, modern bookshelf from a Scandinavian company. A piece for the White Room, a symbol of the new, uncluttered life I was going to build. It had been backordered. I'd completely forgotten about it. Right, yes, sorry, I mumbled, scribbling my name on the screen. The driver nodded, hauled the long, heavy box onto his dolly, and wheeled it to my doorstep. He left it there with a grunt and drove off. I stared at the box. It was immense. On the side, in cheerful, minimalist font, were the words, "Easy assembly, fun for the whole family." An illustration showed a smiling, perfectly coiffed couple effortlessly slotting pieces together, a gleeful child at their feet. The image felt like a personal attack. I couldn't lift it. It was too heavy, too awkward. I felt the hot sting of frustrated tears. This was a metaphor for everything. The simple task of building a new life, broken down into a million incomprehensible pieces, with instructions that were anything but easy. And I was alone. The whole family was a cruel joke. "Need a hand?" Ian's voice came from behind me. I turned. He was standing in the doorway, his head cocked, looking from my undoubtedly distressed face to the massive, mocking box. It's just a bookshelf," I said, my voice cracking. "I can manage." The protest was automatic, born from a newfound, fierce independence. I didn't need a man. I especially didn't need this man, whom I barely knew, to see me as helpless. He didn't move. Those boxes are deceptively heavy, and easy assembly is the biggest lie ever told by the global furniture industry. It's a gateway to divorce and thrown screwdrivers. He said it with such dry, earnest seriousness that a surprised laugh hiccuped out of me. It was a strangled, watery sound. He smiled. "Let me help. Consider it part of the structural engineering service, stress testing the assembly instructions." I was too tired, too emotionally raw to fight it. The sheer scale of the task alone was overwhelming. I nodded, defeated. "Okay, thank you." He stepped out and effortlessly lifted one end of the box. "Lead the way." We maneuvered the behemoth into the white room, laying it flat on the drop cloth-covered floor. Ian found a utility knife in his jacket pocket and sliced the tape open. We pulled out a cascade of cardboard, styrofoam, and a bewildering array of particle board panels, bags of screws, dowels, and a single, comically small Allen wrench. I found the instruction manual. It was a wordless pamphlet of cartoon diagrams that seemed to have been translated through several languages, each more confusing than the last. "Right," Ian said, kneeling on the floor. "Step 1, he held up the pamphlet, squinting at it. "It appears we are to attach part A to part B using the magic of hope and these little wooden pegs." And so began the most absurd, frustrating, and strangely cathartic hour of my life. The easy assembly was a nightmare. The diagrams were ambiguous. The pre-drilled holes didn't always line up. At one point, we realized we'd attached a side panel upside down and had to start over. Ian, the master of complex structural equations, would frown at the simplistic drawings, muttering things like, "The shear force on this cam lock is negligible. Why is it so difficult?" I found myself laughing. Really laughing. Not the wild, unhinged laugh from my guitar frenzy, but a genuine, helpless laughter born of shared frustration. We were two highly educated, capable adults, brought to our knees by a flat-pack bookshelf. "Okay, hold this piece steady," he instructed, his brow furrowed in concentration as he tried to screw a shelf support into place. I held the wobbling panel, my hands brushing against his. The contact was electric, a jolt of simple, human warmth that was so unfamiliar it was almost shocking. I flinched back slightly. He noticed. He paused, his eyes meeting mine. The laughter died in the air between us. The room was suddenly very quiet. The only sound was our breathing. He didn't say anything. He just held my gaze for a moment longer than was necessary, a question in his eyes. Then he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and went back to work, his focus on the screw. It was a tiny moment, but it changed the atmosphere. The easy camaraderie was now tinged with a new, potent tension. We worked in silence for a few minutes, the air thick with things unsaid. "You play?" he asked finally, nodding toward the guitar leaning against the amplifier. "I'm learning," I said. "It's loud." A small smile touched his lips. "I bet it is." He didn't ask why. He didn't need to. The understanding was there in the space between us. He understood that sometimes you needed to make noise. We finally, miraculously, reached the final step. The bookshelf stood upright, a tottering monument to our perseverance. It was crooked. One of the shelves had a distinct slope. It was the most imperfect, lopsided thing I had ever seen. We stood back and looked at it. Ian had a smudge of dust on his cheek. I probably did too. Well, he said, hands on his hips. It's structurally questionable. I looked at the crooked bookshelf, then at Ian, and I started to laugh again. It was a free, full-bodied laugh that came from deep within my belly. He joined in, his warm baritone filling the white room. It's perfect, I said, wiping a tear from my eye. It's got character. He looked at me, and his laughter softened into a smile. It does. The moment stretched. The shared laughter, the collaborative effort, the quiet understanding, it had built something in the room far more significant than the lopsided bookshelf. It had built a connection, a fragile, tentative bridge across the chasm of my grief. He glanced at his watch. I should probably go, let you get back to your renovations. I walked him to the door. The Colorado evening was setting in, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Thank you, Ian, I said, and I meant it for more than just the bookshelf. For the report, and for the structural support. He smiled, a real, full smile that reached his eyes. Anytime, Aliner. He hesitated, then added, for the record, I think you're doing a great job with the renovations, both here and elsewhere. He turned and walked to his car. I stood in the doorway, watching him drive away until his taillights disappeared around the corner. I closed the door and leaned against it, the silence of the house settling around me once more. But it was a different silence now. It wasn't filled with ghosts or echoes of arguments. It was filled with the memory of laughter, with the image of a crooked bookshelf, with the lingering warmth of a hand that had brushed against mine. I walked back into the white room and looked at the lopsided creation. It was a mess. It was imperfect. It was nothing like the flawless, curated life I had tried to build before. And for the first time, that felt like a victory. The stress test wasn't just for the bookshelf. It was for me, and I hadn't collapsed. I'd built something, however crooked, with my own 2 hands, and I hadn't built it alone. The crooked bookshelf stood in the white room like a monument to a battle won. Every time I passed it, a faint smile touched my lips. It was imperfect, stubborn, and entirely its own thing. Much like me these days. Ian's presence had left a warmth in the house that lingered for days, a subtle scent of leather, coffee, and sawdust that was slowly overwriting the ghost of Daniel's cologne. A week after the bookshelf assembly, an email arrived from Ian. The subject line was simply, Library Report Final. My stomach did a small, familiar flip. I clicked it open, expecting a dense, technical document. The body of the email was brief and professional. Aliner, please find the final report attached. The historical board has already received their copy, and I'm pleased to inform you, has given their preliminary approval. Your design, with the modifications, is a go. Well done. Best, Ian, that was it. No mention of the bookshelf, no personal aside, just pure, unadulterated professionalism. A part of me was relieved. The other part, a part I was ashamed to acknowledge, felt a sharp pang of disappointment. The connection I thought we'd forged over particle board and an Allen wrench had apparently been a temporary illusion, a moment of shared insanity now relegated to the past. I replied with an equally professional thank you and tried to put it out of my mind. I had my own battles to fight. The divorce paperwork had arrived, a thick packet of legal jargon that turned my stomach. Dividing assets felt like dissecting a corpse. Every item, the house, the retirement accounts, the damn coffee maker, was a bone of contention. Daniel, through his lawyer, was being difficult, challenging my valuation of the house, of all things. The house I had designed. The anger was a cold, constant companion. It was a Friday evening. Liam was at a sleepover. The silence of the house was no longer a comfort. It was a vacuum, threatening to suck me into a spiral of legal dread and bitter memories. I picked up the guitar, but even the power chords felt hollow, unable to drown out the voice of my lawyer in my head. My phone buzzed on the floor beside me. I glanced at it, expecting a text from Liam's friend's mother. It was an unknown number. Hey, Aliner, it's Ian Blackwood. I know this is unprofessional and probably out of line, but I'm cooking a massive pot of bolognese. It's a family recipe, and I always make enough for a small army. I remember you said you were in the middle of renovations and probably living on takeout. If you're free and would like a proper home-cooked meal, no strings attached, the door's open. I'm at 34 Oak Lane. No pressure at all. Just thought I'd offer. I read the message. Then I read it again. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was unprecedented. This was a line being crossed, boldly and explicitly. The randomized parameter flashed in my mind. Is an amazing cook and loves to host dinners. It was no longer an abstract data point. It was a text message that had just thrown a grenade into my carefully managed isolation. Every instinct screamed no. It was too soon. It was too complicated. He was a consultant on my project. This was a boundary violation. What would it lead to? More confusion? More pain? I was a raw nerve. The idea of sitting across a table from a kind, attractive man making conversation was terrifying. I typed out a reply. Thank you so much, Ian, that's incredibly kind. But I'm swamped with work tonight. Really appreciate the offer, though. I stared at the words. They were safe. They were a retreat behind my professional walls. All I had to do was press send. But I didn't. I thought about the cold, silent kitchen. I thought about the divorce papers on my desk. I thought about the prospect of another evening alone with my anger. And then I thought about the sound of Ian's laugh in my white room. I thought about the way he'd looked at the crooked bookshelf with a sense of shared accomplishment. Before I could lose my nerve, I deleted the message. My fingers trembled as I typed a new one. That sounds amazing, actually. I haven't had a proper meal in weeks. What can I bring? His reply was almost instantaneous. Just yourself. See you soon. An hour later, I stood on the porch of a modest, craftsman-style bungalow on Oak Lane. The garden was a little wild, but well-tended. Through the front window, I could see a warm, golden light and the silhouette of a man moving in a kitchen. The smell of garlic, tomatoes, and herbs wafted through the cool evening air. It was the most welcoming scent I had encountered in months. I knocked, feeling like a teenager on a first date. Ian opened the door. He was wearing a simple apron over a t-shirt and jeans, and he held a wooden spoon. A genuine, unreserved smile spread across his face. You came. He sounded pleasantly surprised. I came, I said, stepping inside. The house was the antithesis of the sterile modern apartment I imagined him in. It was warm, lived in, and unapologetically authentic. Books were piled on shelves. A well-worn leather sofa faced a fireplace. The walls were adorned not with generic art, but with beautiful, technical architectural drawings and a few stunning landscape photographs. And the kitchen was the heart of the home. It was slightly chaotic, with pots simmering, a cutting board dusted with parsley, and a loaf of crusty bread on the counter. The rich, savory smell was intoxicating. Make yourself at home, he said, gesturing vaguely. Wine's open on the counter. Glasses are above the dishwasher. I'm just finishing the sauce. I poured a glass of red wine, my nerves beginning to settle in the comforting chaos. I leaned against the kitchen doorway, watching him cook. He moved with an easy confidence, tasting the sauce, adding a pinch of salt, stirring with a practiced hand. This wasn't for show. This was who he was. This is a great house, I said. Thanks, it's a constant work in progress. I bought it as a fixer-upper 10 years ago. Still fixing. He grinned. It's good therapy. When you spend all day calculating stresses and loads for other people's dreams, it's nice to come home and just hit something with a hammer. I laughed. I can relate to that. We ate at a small wooden table in the kitchen. The food was sublime. The pasta was perfectly al dente, the sauce deep and complex. It was more than a meal, it was an act of care. We talked. Not about work, not about the library. We talked about books. We discovered a shared love for sprawling historical fiction. We talked about Colorado, about favorite hiking trails. He told me about growing up with 2 older brothers and how that taught him to cook. It was either that or starve. I told him about Liam, about his obsession with dinosaurs, and it didn't feel like a burden to share. It felt natural, it was easy, shockingly easy. There were no awkward pauses, no forced topics. The conversation flowed like the wine. For the first time in a year, I felt normal. I felt like myself, not Eleanor the betrayed wife or Eleanor the struggling architect, but just Eleanor. After dinner, we moved to the living room with fresh cups of coffee. He gestured to one of the framed landscape photos on the wall, a breathtaking shot of a misty valley at sunrise. I took that one, up near Crested Butte, had to hike in at 3 a.m. to get that light. It's stunning, I said, meaning it. You're very talented. It's just a hobby, helps me see the world in a different scale. reminds me that most of our problems are pretty small in the grand scheme of things. He looked at me, his expression softening. How are you really a leaner with everything? The question hung in the air. It was the first direct, personal question he'd asked. I could have given him the polished, I'm managing answer. But the warmth of the food, the wine, the easy conversation, and the genuine concern in his eyes disarmed me. I looked down into my coffee cup. It's a day-by-day thing, I said quietly. Some days the anger is so loud I can't hear myself think. Other days it's just this profound sadness, like I'm mourning a person who's still alive. And then I feel guilty for being sad because I should be angry and it's all just a mess. I looked up at him. I'm a mess. He listened, his gaze steady and unwavering. He didn't try to fix it. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He just said, it sounds like you're feeling exactly what you need to feel. There's no blueprint for this, Alina. No right way to do it. The simplicity and acceptance in his words were a balm. He wasn't looking for a neat narrative, he was just acknowledging the mess. Thank you, I whispered. For this, for dinner. For not treating me like I'm broken. You're not broken, he said, his voice firm but gentle. You're under renovation. There's a big difference. Our eyes met and held. The space between us on the sofa seemed to shrink, charged with a new, undeniable energy. The kindness, the shared laughter, the mutual respect, it had all been leading to this quiet point. I could see the same hesitation, the same hope reflected in his eyes. He slowly, deliberately reached out and covered my hand with his. His hand was warm, rough from work, and solid. It felt like an anchor. It was just a hand. A simple touch. But it was the first loving, intentional touch from a man since my world had ended. It wasn't a demand. It was a question. And in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of his home, the scent of good food, and the profound sense of being seen, I had my answer. I turned my hand over and laced my fingers through his. It was a small movement, a silent agreement, but it felt like the welding together of two separate, damaged structures. It wasn't a final solution. It was just a start. A strong, steady, promising start. And for the first time, the future didn't just have potential, it had a heartbeat. Holding Ian's hand was like switching on a light in a room I'd been fumbling through in the dark for months. The path ahead was still unclear, but I could finally see my own feet. I could see the solid floor beneath me. That simple, silent clasp on his sofa was a promise, not of a guaranteed happy ending, but of a shared journey. It was the moment I stopped being a solo act, howling my pain into an electric guitar, and became part of a duet. The following weeks were a study in gentle, terrifying, wonderful reintegration. Our time together was no longer confined to construction sites or the crisis zone of my home. We graduated to the mundane, and in the mundane, I found a magic I thought was lost forever. A text would arrive on a Saturday morning. Farmer's market? I need a victim for my zucchini bread experiment. And I would go, pushing aside the fear of who might see us, the ghost of Daniel's judgment. We'd wander between stalls, our hands brushing against baskets of ripe tomatoes and bunches of fresh herbs. Ian would chat easily with the farmers, asking about their growing methods, and I'd watch him, this solid, earnest man who found joy in the provenance of a squash. It was so different from Daniel's performative charm. This was real. This was rooted. One drizzly Sunday afternoon, the randomized parameter manifested itself with a vengeance. We were in my kitchen, and the conversation turned to the stark emptiness of the white room. It needs life, Ian stated, looking through the doorway. Plants, books, something that isn't a symbol of cathartic destruction. I know, I sighed. I just haven't had the energy to curate. Who said anything about curating? He grinned. I saw a flea market on the way here. Looks like the kind of place that specializes in things with stories, not a matching set. An hour later, we were wandering through a vast, muddy field packed with stalls under flapping tarps. The air smelled of rain, damp earth, and frying food. It was chaotic, overwhelming, and utterly delightful. We found a vendor selling old books, their pages yellowed and smelling of vanilla and thyme. Ian unearthed a first edition of a book on Frank Lloyd Wright, its cover faded but intact. His eyes lit up like a child's. "Look at this," he said, handing it to me with reverence. "The plates are incredible." I found a battered copy of Jane Eyre, a novel I'd loved as a teenager. We bought them, our first shared possessions, insignificant in cost but monumental in meaning. Then we saw it. Leaning against the back of a truck, surrounded by less interesting furniture, was a chair. It wasn't just any chair. It was an architectural marvel of misguided ambition. It was supposedly a rocking chair, but its lines were a bizarre fusion of Art Deco and rustic farmhouse, with one rocker that was visibly longer than the other. It was painted a truly alarming shade of lime green. We stared at it in simultaneous horror and fascination. "It's the ugliest thing I've ever seen," I whispered. "It's magnificent," Ian countered, his voice full of awe. "It has no self-doubt whatsoever. It fully commits to its own terrible idea." We bought the chair for $20, laughing like fools as we wrestled its awkward, lime green form into the back of his 4Runner. It was our shared joke, a testament to the fact that we didn't need everything to be perfect. We could find joy in the gloriously imperfect. But the true test, the real stress test of this new foundation, came with the introduction of the most critical element. Liam, I was terrified. How would my son, whose world had been so violently shaken, react to a new man? A man who wasn't his father. I had nightmares of Liam being cold, withdrawn, or worse, feeling betrayed. I decided on a low-pressure, activity-focused introduction. The randomized parameter provided the perfect cover, building furniture together with comical instructions. I bought a simple, small desk for Liam's room. A project, a task. The day Ian was to come over for the desk assembly, my anxiety was a live wire. I'd prepped Liam, keeping it casual. "Remember my friend Ian, the engineer who helped me with the bookshelf? He's coming over to help us build your new desk. He's really good with tools." Liam, ever pragmatic, had just shrugged. "Okay, does he know not to use the wrong screwdriver like Dad always does?" The memory of Daniel's domestic incompetence, once a source of irritation, now felt like a bittersweet artifact. When Ian arrived, he didn't come empty-handed. He brought a toolbox, but also a small, wrapped package. "For the foreman," he said, handing it to Liam. Liam, suspicious, opened it. It was a miniature, fully functional engineer's hammer and a small hard hat with "Boss" written on the front. Liam's eyes went wide. It was the perfect gift, not a toy but a tool, a symbol of respect. "All right, boss," Ian said, kneeling down to Liam's level. "We've got a job to do. I'll handle the heavy lifting, but you're in charge of the instructions and quality control." "Deal?" Liam, trying to suppress a smile, nodded seriously. "Deal?" I hovered in the doorway of his room, my heart in my throat, watching them. Ian was a natural. He didn't talk down to Liam. He explained what they were doing, why a cam lock was a clever invention, why it was important to check for square. He gave Liam real jobs to do, holding pieces steady, handing him the correct Allen key. There were the promised comical instructions. They put a panel on backward, they dropped a bag of screws, which scattered everywhere. But instead of frustration, it was met with laughter. Ian showed Liam a trick for finding lost screws with a magnet. I watched my son's face. The initial wariness melted away, replaced by concentration, then by a glow of pride as the desk began to take shape. He wasn't just building a desk, he was building confidence. He was being taught, listened to, valued. At one point, Ian's hand brushed against mine as we both reached for a screwdriver. Our eyes met. He gave me a small, private smile that said, "It's okay. See, we've got this." And in that moment, I saw it clearly. Daniel had been like drywall, a surface, a finish. He'd looked the part, but he couldn't bear any real weight. When pressure came, he crumbled. Ian was different. Ian was a load-bearing wall. He was quiet, strong, essential. He wasn't there for show, he was there to support the structure. He was supporting me, not by trying to fix my pain, but by simply being a steady presence beside me. And now, I saw him beginning to support my son, offering a different model of manhood, one based on competence, patience, and integrity. When the desk was finished, slightly wobbly, but standing, Liam stood back and beamed. He immediately started arranging his dinosaur models on it. "Thanks, Ian," he said, and the simple, unforced gratitude in his voice was the most beautiful sound I'd heard in a year. "Anytime, boss," Ian replied, ruffling his hair. Later, after Liam was in bed, Ian and I sat on the sofa, the infamous lime green chair a silent, ugly sentinel in the corner. The house was quiet, but it was a peaceful quiet, filled with the echo of laughter and the scent of sawdust. "He's a great kid, Alina," Ian said softly. "He is," I said, leaning my head against his shoulder. Thank you for today. For everything, you were amazing with him. It was easy, he said simply. He's a part of you. Tears welled in my eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness or anger. They were tears of relief, of gratitude. The last brick of the wall around my heart crumbled. I had been so afraid of letting someone in, of risking another collapse. But I realized now that I wasn't adding a new, fragile wing to a damaged structure. I was reinforcing the foundation. I was adding a load-bearing wall. I turned my face up to his. "Stay," I whispered. It wasn't an invitation for a night. It was an invitation for everything that came after. The messy, imperfect, beautiful everything. He looked into my eyes, his own gaze clear and certain. He cupped my face in his hand, his thumb gently wiping away a stray tear. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. And for the first time, I believed it. The demolition was over. The new blueprint was being drawn, not in lines on paper, but in moments like these. And it was stronger and more beautiful than anything I could have ever designed alone. The word stay had unlocked a new phase of existence. Ian didn't just stay that night. He slowly, organically, began to weave himself into the fabric of our lives. It wasn't a formal move-in. It was a gradual migration. A toothbrush appeared next to mine. A few of his sturdy flannel shirts found a home in the closet, hanging beside my sweaters, a stark, comforting contrast to Daniel's abandoned suits. His well-used toolbox took up permanent residence in my garage, a symbol of repair rather than demolition. Our relationship became a quiet, steady rhythm. Weeknights were for simple dinners, helping Liam with homework, and the easy silence of two people reading on the sofa, his feet resting in my lap. Weekends were for adventures, big and small. We tackled the neglected garden, Ian teaching Liam how to turn the soil while I designed new planting beds. We took the infamous lime green chair on a field trip to a scenic overlook, laughing as we took photos of it against the majestic backdrop of the Rockies. It was our shared totem of imperfection. The randomized parameter of his positive trait is an amazing cook and loves to host dinners, blossomed into a central joy of our new life. Our home, once a place of silent pain, began to fill with noise and warmth again. It started small. Ian would cook a massive pot of chili or a tray of lasagna, and inevitably we'd end up inviting my colleague, Sarah, and her wife over, or the nice retired couple from next door. The sound of laughter and clinking silverware in my dining room was a balm to my soul. But the true test of this new, reconstructed life was the house. My house. The one I had designed, the one that held the ghosts of my marriage to Daniel. The divorce settlement was final. I had bought out Daniel's share. The house was legally, unequivocally mine, but emotionally it was still a contested space. Every room held an echo. One evening, as we were cleaning up after a lively dinner with friends, Ian leaned against the counter and looked at me, his expression thoughtful. "This is a good house, Aliner," he said. "It has great bones. The flow is incredible." "Thank you," I said, feeling a familiar pang. It was my first major residential design. "I know," he said softly. He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But it feels like you're living in a museum of a life that's over. You've whitewashed the walls, but the floor plan is still his." His words hit their mark with unerring accuracy. He was right. For all my redecorating, I'd only been applying a new coat of paint to an old blueprint. The fundamental structure of my life here was built around a family that no longer existed. "What are you saying?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I'm saying we should think about a real change, not just a new chair or a coat of paint." He gestured around us. This was a chapter, a beautiful, important one. But the story has changed, drastically. He walked over to me, taking my hands in his. "We're writing a new story now. You, me, Liam, shouldn't we have a setting that's designed for us? Not a setting you have to constantly defend against the past?" The randomized parameter for Je et El Yeri flashed in my mind. Modern apartment in the city. It had seemed like just another data point. Now it felt like a prophecy. A thrilling, terrifying one. Selling the house. Leaving the suburbs, moving into the heart of Denver. The idea was audacious. It was a complete teardown, not just a renovation. "An apartment," I said, the concept feeling alien. "But the garden, Liam's school, the memories," Ian finished for me gently. "Exactly. We can find a place with a rooftop garden. Liam's a resilient kid. He'll make new friends, And as for memories, he smiled, we'll make our own, better ones. The decision wasn't made that night. It unfolded over weeks of late-night talks, of scrolling through real estate listings, of taking Liam to explore different city neighborhoods. To my amazement, Liam was excited by the idea of living in a building with a doorman and being able to walk to a comic book store. The world, through his eyes, was an adventure. The day we put the house on the market was a bittersweet symphony of emotions. I walked through the empty rooms, my footsteps echoing. I stood in the white room where I had screamed my grief into a guitar. I stood in the kitchen where Ian and I had assembled a crooked bookshelf. I stood in the doorway of Liam's room, where a new desk stood as a testament to a new kind of strength. This house had been a cradle and a crucible. It had held my greatest joy and my most profound pain. I placed a hand on the wall, silently thanking it for its service. It had sheltered me until I was strong enough to leave. Finding the new place happened with a speed that felt fated. It was a modern, corner apartment in a low-rise building in Lodhu, with floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded the space with light and offered a stunning view of the city skyline and the distant mountains. It was an open canvas, a blank page. The moment we walked in, the three of us, we knew. Liam ran to the window, pressing his face against the glass. Ian looked at me, his eyes asking the question. "This is it," I said, my heart swelling with a sense of possibility so intense it was almost dizzying. "This is ours." The move was chaotic and hilarious, embodying our new shared activity, building furniture together with comical instructions. Only this time, it was on a grand scale. We built our new bed, our new dining table, our new lives. The lime green chair was given a place of honor by the window, a cherished reminder of where we started. The night we moved in, we ordered pizza and ate it sitting on the floor, surrounded by towers of boxes. The city lights twinkled outside our window, a galaxy of new beginnings. Ian raised a paper cup of soda. "To the new blueprint," he said. Liam raised his cup. "To the apartment with the cool elevator." I raised mine, looking at the two of them, my son, my love, my family. "To us," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "To our forever home." It wasn't the house that made it a home, it was the people inside it. I had finally learned the difference. I had designed the old house, but we were building this new one together, nail by nail, laugh by laugh, moment by moment. And for the first time, the foundation felt truly, unshakably solid. Life in the apartment was a symphony of new rhythms. The morning light through the floor-to-ceiling windows was different from the suburban dawn, sharper, more ambitious, painting the polished concrete floors with long, dramatic shadows. The sounds were an urban lullaby of distant traffic, the hum of the elevator, and the occasional siren. A stark contrast to the bird-chirping quiet of our old street. It was a constant, gentle reminder that we were not just in a new home, we were in a new life. A year had passed since the move. The boxes were long gone, replaced by a harmonious blend of my minimalist aesthetic, Ian's rugged, well-traveled artifacts, and Liam's vibrant explosion of Lego creations and dinosaur posters. The lime green chair held court in a corner, a beloved eyesore that had become the unofficial throne for reading stories. Our home was full, alive, and vibrantly us. Ian's integration into our lives was so seamless it felt predestined. He was the calm to my occasional storm, the practical hands that built the dreams I sketched on paper. He never tried to replace Daniel. He carved out a space that was entirely his own. He was the one who taught Liam how to properly throw a baseball in the park downstairs. He was the one who remembered to buy my favorite coffee beans without being asked. He was the steady heartbeat of our little family. But a tiny, stubborn part of me, a scar tissue from the past, still waited for the other shoe to drop. The happiness was so profound, so seemingly fragile, that I sometimes found myself holding my breath, waiting for a crack to appear. It was the PTSD of betrayal, a phantom limb of pain that would twinge on the most perfect of days. The randomized parameter for our building furniture together with comical instructions had become a cherished family ritual. It was our metaphor for everything. Things might not start perfectly, but with patience, teamwork, and a lot of laughter, you could build something wonderful and uniquely yours. One Saturday afternoon, the ritual took on a new significance. A large, flat cardboard box was delivered to our door. It was taller and wider than any we'd tackled before. "What's this?" I asked, looking at the shipping label. It was addressed to all three of us. Ian feigned innocence, but I saw the glint in his eye. A surprise, for the living room, I thought we could use a proper bookshelf, a big one, for all our books. Liam, now 10 and ever eager for a project, bounced on the balls of his feet. Yes, can we build it now? Please. The box was colossal. We hauled it into the center of the living room, and the sheer scale of it promised an afternoon of glorious frustration. Ian fetched the toolbox, his toolbox, and we began the familiar dance. Slitting the tape, the hiss of cardboard giving way, the cascade of styrofoam peanuts and meticulously wrapped pieces of wood. The instructions were, as predicted, comically inadequate. A single sheet of paper with blurry, minimalist diagrams that seemed to suggest the whole thing should assemble itself through wishful thinking. Okay, Ian said, adopting his familiar role of project manager. Liam, you're on part identification. Eleanor, you're on diagram interpretation. I'll handle the heavy lifting and strategic swearing. We got to work. The first hour was a predictable comedy of errors. We attached a backing panel upside down. We misidentified cam lock A for cam lock B, resulting in a wobble that would have made a funhouse mirror proud. At one point, a crucial shelf support disappeared entirely, only to be found 10 minutes later by Liam, who had been using it as a sword. We were covered in a fine layer of cardboard dust, and I had a smudge of grease on my cheek from a stubborn screw. But through the chaos, there was a deep, abiding joy. Liam's giggles were infectious. Ian's patient explanations to Liam about why we needed to check for square filled me with a warm, liquid love. This was it. This was the family I had barely dared to dream of in the depths of my grief. As we progressed, however, I began to notice something strange. The bookshelf was different. The materials were of a quality far beyond the usual particle board. The wood was solid oak, heavy and beautifully grained. The hardware was brushed brass, not the standard silver-colored plastic. And the design, now that it was taking shape, was unmistakably mid-century modern, clean and elegant. This was no mass-produced flat pack. This was a piece of serious, heirloom-quality furniture. Ian, I said, running my hand over a smooth shelf, this is incredible. This must have cost a fortune. He looked up from where he was kneeling, securing a base panel. His expression was unreadable, a mix of nervousness and excitement. It's a special piece. We continued, the atmosphere shifting slightly. The playful frustration gave way to a focused reverence. As we slotted the final top piece into place, the bookshelf stood before us, magnificent and imposing. It was a masterpiece. It fit the exact dimensions of the alcove in our living room as if it had been custom designed for it, which I realized with a sudden, breath-catching jolt it probably had been. Ian stood up, wiping his hands on his jeans. He looked at the bookshelf, then at me, then at Liam, who was gazing at our creation with pride. It's not quite finished, Ian said, his voice unusually soft. What do you mean? I asked. It looks perfect. He walked over to the toolbox and pulled out a small, long wooden box I'd never seen before. It was made of the same beautiful oak as the bookshelf. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. This was no tool. Liam was watching, his eyes wide, sensing the shift in the air. Ian came to stand in front of me. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, catching the dust motes still dancing around us, surrounding him in a golden halo. He looked into my eyes, and the love I saw there was so vast, so certain, it stole my breath. Eleanor, he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Building this bookshelf with you and Liam today, it felt like a metaphor for the last 2 years. We started with a pile of broken pieces and a set of instructions that made no sense. There were times we put things on backwards, times we got frustrated, times we lost our way, but we never gave up. We kept building, together. He opened the wooden box. Nestled inside against a bed of velvet were not one, but 3 objects. A simple, stunning solitaire diamond ring that caught the light and threw rainbows across the floor. A smaller, matching band, sized for a boy. And a small, intricately carved oak key. Tears welled in my eyes, blurring the beautiful, impossible sight. This family we've built, Ian continued, his gaze including Liam now. It's the strongest, most beautiful thing I've ever been a part of. It's my home. You are my home, both of you. He took the ring from the box and got down on one knee right there on the dusty floor, amidst the discarded packaging and tools. Liam gasped, his hand flying to his mouth. "Eleanor Reed," Ian said, his voice ringing with conviction in the sunlit room. "Will you do me the incredible honor of becoming my wife? Will you let me be your husband and," he turned to Liam, "will you let me be your dad officially? I want to be a part of your story forever." He held up the small oak key. "And this is the key to this bookshelf. There's a hidden compartment in the base. It's for our family secrets, our dreams, our promises. It's the first piece of furniture in our forever home." The phantom limb of pain, the fear that had haunted me, vanished. It was vaporized by the sheer, overwhelming force of this man's love. He wasn't just asking me to marry him. He was asking us, me and Liam, to be his family. He had designed this entire moment, this beautiful, personal, perfect moment, around the very essence of who we were. I looked at Liam. His face was a mixture of awe and hope. He gave me a tiny, eager nod. I dropped to my knees in front of Ian, not caring about the dust or the tears streaming down my face. I took his face in my hands. "Yes," I whispered, my voice cracking with emotion. "Yes, I will marry you. And yes," I looked at Liam, who was beaming now, "we would be so lucky to have you as our dad." Ian slid the ring onto my finger. It fit perfectly. It felt not like a new weight, but like a missing piece finally clicking into place. Then he took the smaller band and gestured to Liam. "For you, son, if you'll wear it." Liam rushed forward, and Ian slipped the band onto his finger. It was a little big, but Liam stared at it as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. We hugged, the three of us, a tangled, laughing, crying heap on the floor of our apartment, surrounded by the evidence of our shared labor and love. The crooked bookshelf, the lime green chair, they had been the practice runs. This bookshelf, this ring, this key, this was the cornerstone. It was the moment the new structure was no longer just stable, it was consecrated. Later that night, after Liam had fallen asleep, still wearing his ring, Ian and I sat on the floor, our backs against the new bookshelf. I held the small oak key in my hand. "What should we put in the secret compartment first?" I asked. Ian smiled, wrapping an arm around me. "How about a promise?" he said softly. "A promise that no matter what the instructions look like, we'll always build it together." I leaned my head against his shoulder, looking out at the city lights. The past was a closed book. The future was a blank page, and we held the pen together. The foundation was poured, the walls were strong, and the house was finally, unquestionably, a home. The morning of our wedding dawned clear and bright, the Colorado sky a seamless, brilliant blue. I stood barefoot on the cool concrete of our apartment, looking out at the mountains, their peaks still dusted with snow despite the late spring warmth. There was no nervous flutter in my stomach, no cold feet. Only a deep, resonant calm, like the stillness at the center of a hurricane. This wasn't a beginning, it was a culmination. The final walkthrough of a structure we had already built, nail by nail, laugh by laugh, tear by tear. I hadn't wanted a big wedding. The thought of a grand spectacle, of performing happiness for a crowd, felt like a betrayal of the intimate, hard-won journey we'd been on. So, we chose the rooftop garden of our building, the one Ian had promised me when he'd first proposed the move. It was a lush, green oasis high above the city, with string lights twining through trellises and the same stunning view of the mountains that had sold us on the apartment. Liam, now officially my best man and beaming with a gravity far beyond his 10 years, helped me into my dress. It wasn't a traditional gown. It was a simple, elegant sheath of ivory crepe that felt like a second skin. It was me. The real me, the me who had emerged from the rubble. "You look beautiful, Mom," Liam said, his voice serious as he fastened a tiny clasp at the back. I turned and knelt before him, taking his hands. They were growing so quickly, no longer a little boy's hands. "Thank you, sweetie, and thank you for being my best man. It means everything to me." He threw his arms around my neck. "I'm glad Ian's our family," he whispered, and the simple declaration was the greatest blessing I could have received. There were only a handful of guests. My colleague Sarah and her wife. The friendly retired couple from our old neighborhood who had become genuine friends. Ian's brother and his family. It was a gathering of our tribe, the people who had witnessed the transformation, not just the result. As I walked toward the simple arch draped with white fabric, where Ian stood waiting with the officiant, my eyes met his. He was wearing a simple dark suit, no tie, and his eyes held the same awe and certainty they had the day he'd knelt on the dusty floor. In that look, I saw our entire story: the broken bookshelves, the shared meals, the quiet nights, the loud laughter. I saw my load-bearing wall. The ceremony was short and personal. We wrote our own vows. Ian's voice was steady and clear as he spoke not just to me, but to Liam, promising to be a constant, a guide, a father in every sense that mattered. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket, a drawing Liam had made of the three of us, with our lime green chair in the foreground. "This is my blueprint for happiness," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And today, we're making it official." When it was my turn, I didn't need notes. The words came from a place so deep and true they felt like they had been written on my soul. "You taught me that a strong structure isn't one that never cracks," I said, holding Ian's gaze. "It's one that has been repaired with love, with patience, and with the right partner. You are my strongest repair. You are my forever home." The officiant pronounced us husband and wife, and as Ian leaned in to kiss me, the city spread out behind him like a promise kept. It was a kiss of completion, of a circle finally closing. But as we pulled away, laughing, the officiant smiled and raised his voice slightly. "And by the power vested in me," he added, a twinkle in his eye, "it is my profound honor to also recognize and celebrate the formation of this new family. Liam, would you like to come up here?" Liam, looking surprised but proud, stepped forward. The officiant placed a hand on his shoulder. "A family is built on love, not just on papers. And today, we witness the beautiful, chosen bond between a mother, a husband, and a son. Welcome to your new family, Liam." Ian and I both pulled him into a hug, a three-way embrace that felt as natural as breathing. The small crowd erupted in cheers and applause. This was the real moment. The wedding was a formality. This was the sacrament. The reception was a joyful, informal affair. There was a picnic table laden with food, most of which Ian had cooked himself. There was music from a simple speaker. A playlist that included everything from the classical pieces I loved to the classic rock Ian adored, and even a few of the punk-infused power chords I'd learned to play. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Ian found me near the edge of the roof, looking out at the view. He slipped his arm around my waist, pulling me close. "Happy?" he murmured into my hair. "More than I ever knew was possible," I said, leaning into his solid warmth. He was quiet for a moment. "I have one more wedding present for you. Well, for us." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, familiar object. The oak key to the secret compartment in our bookshelf. "What is it?" I asked, curious. "A new promise to put inside," he said, his voice low and intimate. "A promise for the future." He led me back inside our apartment, down to the living room where the magnificent bookshelf stood. The party continued softly on the roof above us. He knelt, inserted the key into the almost invisible lock on the base of the shelf, and opened the small, hidden door. Inside was the drawing Liam had made, and the original, torn photograph of me from Hawaii, the one I'd ripped in half. Ian had found the pieces and kept them, a testament to where I'd come from. He took out a small, blank piece of parchment and a pen. "Our promise," he said, handing the pen to me. "You first." I thought for a moment, then wrote a single word. "Expand." Ian smiled, a slow, deep smile that reached his eyes. He took the pen and below my word he wrote, "Together." He placed the parchment inside the compartment, next to the artifacts of our past, and closed the door, locking it with a soft click. The meaning was unspoken but crystal clear. Our family was complete, but our love was not static. It was a living thing, meant to grow. We stood up and I looked around our home. The city lights twinkled outside, the lime green chair stood guard, and the sounds of our friends and our son laughing drifted down from the roof. The ghost of the woman I had been, the one crying on the therapist's couch, the one tearing a photograph in half, the one screaming her pain into a guitar, was finally at peace. She hadn't disappeared, she had been integrated, like a strong repair in a beloved old building. She was the foundation upon which this joy was built. Ian took my hand, his new wedding band cool against my skin. "Ready to go back to the party, Mrs. Blackwood?" I squeezed his hand. "Ready." We walked back out into the twilight, toward the music and the laughter, toward our son, toward our future. The demolition was complete. The renovation was over. We were no longer a project under construction. We were home. and we were finally, unequivocally whole.